From as early as I can remember, my place in the family was never discussed, only assumed. No one sat me down and explained what was expected of me. Yet the expectations were always there, quietly shaping how I moved through the world. I learned early that I was supposed to be the steady one, the one who did not cause trouble, the one who could be relied upon without question, while others were allowed to falter, to forget, or to be forgiven. I was praised for being capable. That praise felt like love at the time, but it was actually instruction. It taught me that my value came from how little I needed and how much I could give. I became observant out of necessity. I noticed which moods required silence, which situations needed fixing before they became problems, and which responsibilities would be left untouched unless I handled them myself. This awareness was never called emotional labor, but that is what it was. I absorbed tension so others did not have to. I adjusted myself to keep the household functioning smoothly. When something went wrong, I felt it was my job to correct it, even if it had nothing to do with me. No one told me to do these things. I simply learned that peace depended on my willingness to step in. As I grew older, the role solidified. Being dependable was no longer something I did. It was who I was. I was introduced as the organized one, the responsible one, the one who had everything together. These labels sounded complimentary, but they also erased any space for struggle. When I felt overwhelmed, it was dismissed because I was strong. When I needed help, it was assumed I would figure it out on my own. Independence became a requirement rather than a choice. I was not allowed to need in the same way others were allowed to need. What made this role especially powerful was how invisible it was. There were no rewards attached to it, no recognition that I was carrying more than my share. Instead, the role operated through silence. When I complied, everything felt normal. When I hesitated, discomfort filled the room. Disappointment appeared in small ways, through tone and body language rather than direct words. Over time, I learned that maintaining harmony meant staying in character. Questioning my role felt like betrayal, not because anyone said so, but because the entire system depended on my participation. I did not realize how deeply this training ran until I left home and carried the role with me. Even in my own life, I prioritized others' needs automatically. I said yes before checking in with myself. I felt guilt when I rested. I measured my worth by how useful I was. The habits formed in that household followed me quietly, shaping my decisions and draining my energy. I believed this was maturity, that being selfless meant being good. I did not yet understand the difference between generosity and obligation. Consent was never part of the equation. I was never asked if I wanted to be the stabilizer, the fixer, the emotional buffer. The role was assigned because I could handle it, not because it was fair. And once I proved capable, stepping out of it became nearly impossible. The more I gave, the more was expected. The role grew heavier with time, but the recognition never grew with it. What began as quiet adaptation became a lifelong performance. Understanding this was not a moment of anger, but of clarity. I saw that the role I had played so well had cost me parts of myself. It had taught me to ignore my limits and silence my needs. Recognizing that I was trained into this position without consent did not make me weak. It made me honest, and honesty was the first step toward reclaiming the parts of me that had been set aside for the comfort of others. There was a time when being reliable felt like a strength I had earned. It was something I carried with pride, a quiet confidence that I could be counted on when things became difficult. I believed reliability meant maturity, that it was proof I had grown into someone dependable and trustworthy. When people leaned on me, I told myself it was because I was capable, not because they were unwilling to stand on their own. For a long time, that belief sustained me. It gave meaning to the extra effort, the late nights, and the sacrifices I made without complaint. The shift from being relied upon to being used did not happen all at once. It arrived gradually, disguised as necessity. Small requests came first, always framed as temporary or unavoidable. A bill here, an errand there, a favor that seemed reasonable in the moment. I said yes because it felt easier than saying no. Saying no would have required explanations, and explanations would have brought discomfort. So I agreed, trusting that balance would eventually return. It never did. Each yes quietly reset the standard, and what was once help became expectation. What made the change difficult to recognize was how ordinary it felt. There was no dramatic demand, no obvious manipulation. Instead, my reliability was folded into the routine of everyone else's life. Plans were made assuming my availability. Decisions were finalized assuming my support. My time, my energy, and even my finances were treated as extensions of a system that functioned smoothly as long as I remained in place. When I fulfilled those expectations, everything felt calm. When I hesitated, tension surfaced immediately, as though I had disrupted something essential. Gratitude faded slowly, almost imperceptibly. At first, there were thank yous, acknowledgments, even brief moments of appreciation. Over time, those disappeared. My contributions were no longer noticed because they were no longer considered optional. They had become part of the background, like electricity or running water only mentioned when something went wrong. That was when I began to understand that I was no longer seen as someone offering help, but as someone responsible for preventing inconvenience. The most unsettling part was how my reliability was used against me. When I expressed fatigue or concern, I was reminded of how capable I was, how much I could handle. My strength became the justification for placing more weight on my shoulders. If I struggled, it was framed as overthinking or unnecessary stress. The message was subtle but clear. My role was to absorb pressure, not to question it. Reliability, once a quality I admired in myself, became the very reason my boundaries were ignored. I started to notice how uneven the dynamic had become. Others were allowed to forget, to falter, to step back when things felt heavy. I was expected to step forward every time. My reliability did not earn me support in return. It excused the absence of it. I was dependable, so no one checked whether I needed help. I was strong, so no one asked whether I was tired. The very traits that define me ensured my needs remained unseen. The realization was not dramatic. It settled slowly, through moments of exhaustion and quiet resentment I did not want to admit. I began to see that being used did not always look like exploitation. Sometimes it looks like constant reliance without reciprocity, like expectations that grow while care does not. I had confused usefulness with belonging and endurance with love. When I finally acknowledged that my reliability had become a tool rather than a trait, it changed how I saw everything. I understood that being dependable should never require self-erasure. Reliability given freely is a gift. Reliability taken for granted is a form of neglect. Recognizing the difference was painful, but it was also freeing. It allowed me to see that my worth was never meant to be measured by how much I could carry for others. And that stepping back was not failure, but self-preservation. Christmas Eve arrived wrapped in expectations I had carried for years. I told myself that showing up mattered, that being present could soften what had been sharp for so long. I prepared carefully, choosing a small gift that felt thoughtful without being excessive. Something that said I remembered and still cared. As I drove toward the house, I rehearsed calm responses in my mind, preparing for polite distance, for the familiar discomfort that hovered beneath family gatherings. I believed I could endure a few hours of quiet tension the way I always had. What I did not realize was that this night would ask something different of me. The moment I stepped inside, the room felt altered, as though the warmth I expected had been replaced with something brittle. The lights glowed softly, music played in the background, and voices mingled. Yet none of it reached me. Before I could set my things down or offer a greeting, the question came, sharp and unapologetic, asking why I was even there. It was not confusion or surprise. It was certainty. I waited instinctively for someone to intervene, for the words to be softened or corrected. Instead, the stillness that followed confirmed everything I had been avoiding for years. What struck me most was not the cruelty of the words, but the calm with which they were delivered. There was no argument, no raised voices, no emotional chaos, The message was delivered with the same tone one might use to state an obvious fact. I was told I was not welcome, and it was said as though this had always been understood. In that moment, the room felt smaller, the air heavier. I became acutely aware of how alone I was, standing in a place I had once believed I belonged. I did not respond the way I might have in the past. I did not explain myself or list the ways I had contributed, the years of quiet support that had held things together. I did not defend my presence or ask for fairness. Something inside me had grown tired of speaking into spaces that refused to listen. The silence I chose was not confusion or fear. It was recognition. I finally saw that my words had never been missing. They had simply never been valued. As I stood there, memories surfaced uninvited. The times I had shown up without being asked. The responsibilities I had taken on because someone needed to. The sacrifices that were never acknowledged because they had become expected. I realized that my presence had always been conditional. Welcome only when it served a purpose. That night stripped away the last illusion that endurance would eventually earn acceptance. Leaving did not feel dramatic. I placed the gift down, untouched, and walked back toward the door. No one stopped me. No one asked me to stay. The celebration continued behind me, as if my departure was simply part of the evening's flow. The cold air outside felt sharp against my skin, but it was also clarifying. For the first time, I was not trying to fix what was broken. I was allowing it to be seen for what it was. That drive home was quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar. My thoughts were steady, not racing. I understood then that silence had been my default for years, but it had never been chosen. It had been imposed. That night, silence became mine. It was not submission. It was a boundary. It marked the end of explaining myself to people who had already decided who I was to them. The Christmas Eve that was meant to be endured became the moment I stopped enduring altogether. It did not end with confrontation or resolution. It ended with clarity. I left behind a role that required my silence to function and stepped into a truth that did not need to be defended. From that night forward, my silence was no longer a weakness. It was the beginning of my self-respect. Removing access did not feel like an act of rebellion. It felt deliberate, almost clinical, as though I were finally responding to reality rather than emotion. After years of being quietly embedded into systems that were never meant to support me in return, I understood that the only way to step out of the role I had been playing was to disconnect from it completely. Words would have invited debate. Explanations would have been twisted into negotiation. So I chose action instead, knowing that systems reveal truths that conversations often conceal. I sat alone at my table and opened accounts that had been familiar for years. Each one represented a thread of obligation that had been tied around me gradually, without ceremony. Phone plans, utilities, subscriptions, insurance payments, emergency funds, things that had become invisible because they worked. I removed my name, canceled authorizations, and closed shared access without hesitation. There was no rush of satisfaction, no sense of victory. What I felt instead was stillness. For the first time, I was not anticipating someone else's reaction. I was simply reclaiming control over my own resources. The truth did not surface immediately. It arrived the way consequences often do. Quietly at first, a missed payment here, a service interruption there. Then confusion set in, followed by urgency. The systems that had relied on my constant presence began to stall. And with them, the illusion that everything had been functioning independently. What had been presented as shared responsibility was exposed as dependence. And that dependence had been carefully disguised as family cooperation. I did not need to witness the unraveling to understand it. I knew the patterns well enough to imagine how quickly inconvenience would turn into blame. Removing access forced a shift in focus. Instead of asking where I was, they began asking what was missing. That distinction mattered. It clarified something I had sensed, but never allowed myself to fully accept. My value had been measured not by who I was, but by what I provided. When the provision stopped, concern did not follow. Reaction did. Attempts to reach me increased, but the language remained indirect. There were questions about whether something had gone wrong, whether I was overwhelmed, whether I had forgotten to renew something. There was no acknowledgement of the night I was told I did not belong. No recognition of the years I had maintained the structure they relied on. The absence of accountability spoke louder than any accusation. It confirmed that access had always mattered more than connection. As the days passed, narratives began forming without me. Stories of abandonment replaced any discussion of dependency. It was easier to frame the situation as betrayal than to admit reliance. By removing access, I had removed the cover that allowed everyone else to remain comfortable. The truth surfaced not through confession, but through reaction. Discomfort revealed what gratitude never had. What surprised me most was how little I felt compelled to correct the story. For years, I had explained myself endlessly, filling silence with justification. Now, silence served a different purpose. It allowed the truth to exist without interference. The more I stayed still, the clearer the pattern became. Those who valued me for myself reached out quietly and without demands. Those who valued what I provided reacted loudly and with urgency. Removing access did not punish anyone. It simply restored balance. It returned responsibility to where it had always belonged. Watching the truth surface was not satisfying, but it was grounding. It stripped away confusion and replaced it with clarity. I no longer questioned whether I had imagined the imbalance or exaggerated my exhaustion. The response to my absence confirmed everything. In choosing to step back, I learned that access is often mistaken for love. When access is unlimited, it hides motives and blurs intentions. When it is removed, reality has nowhere to hide. The truth surfaced because it had been waiting all along, buried beneath convenience. And once seen, it could not be unseen. For a long time, I questioned my own perceptions. I told myself that maybe I was being too sensitive, that perhaps I had misunderstood intentions or exaggerated patterns that were never meant to harm me. It was easier to believe in miscommunication than to accept the idea that the dynamics I lived within were deliberate. Doubt became a familiar companion, one that kept me compliant and quiet. If I could convince myself it was accidental, then I could continue enduring it without having to confront the deeper truth. That illusion collapsed the moment evidence replaced instinct. Seeing the conversations laid out plainly stripped away every excuse I had ever made on behalf of others. The words were not emotional or impulsive. They were structured, thoughtful, and precise. There were plans, timing, and strategy woven into each exchange. Reading them felt less like discovering a secret and more like finally being allowed to see the blueprint of a system I had been trapped inside for years. What made it undeniable was the language used to describe me. I was not spoken about with concern or affection. I was referenced in terms of reliability, predictability, and outcome. My reactions were anticipated and discussed as variables to be managed. There was no curiosity about how I felt or whether I was overwhelmed. Instead, there was confidence that I would respond exactly as expected. That confidence had not come from love. It had come from repetition and conditioning. The manipulation was never loud or aggressive. It was subtle, calculated, and disguised as care. It relied on guilt more than force, on expectation rather than demand. The messages revealed how carefully those tools had been chosen. There were suggestions on when to reach out, how to frame requests, and which emotional angles would be most effective. Hesitation from me was not respected as a boundary, but anticipated as a phase to be pushed through. Silence was not concern. It was strategy. What struck me most was how ordinary the planning seemed to them. There was no sense of wrongdoing in their tone. They spoke casually, as though discussing logistics rather than a person's life. That ease revealed how normalized my role had become. I was not being helped into responsibility. I was being managed. The system depended on my compliance, and everyone involved understood that maintaining it required coordination. Even more painful than the planning itself was the absence of empathy within it. No one asked whether the cost to me was sustainable. No one wondered if the weight I carried was fair. The focus remained entirely on outcomes and benefits. That absence clarified something I had long avoided. The harm I experienced was not a byproduct of stress or confusion. It was collateral damage in a process designed to serve others. Understanding that the manipulation was intentional did not provoke anger the way I expected. Instead, it brought a deep sense of clarity. It explained why speaking up had never changed anything. It explained why apologies felt hollow and why patterns always repeated. There had never been misunderstanding to resolve. There had only been a system to maintain. Once I accepted that truth, self-blame lost its power. I stopped asking what I could have done differently or how I might have communicated better. No amount of clarity or kindness would have altered a dynamic that relied on my silence. The proof freed me from the need to fix what was never broken by accident. Knowing that the manipulation was deliberate allowed me to finally trust myself. It validated the exhaustion, the resentment, and the quiet sense of loss I had carried without language. The truth did not restore what had been taken, but it did restore my sense of reality. And with that, it became impossible to return to a role that required me to pretend the harm was unintentional. Walking away did not feel like a dramatic act of defiance. It felt calm, almost understated, as though I were finally aligning my actions with a truth I had carried quietly for years. Choosing myself was not about anger or punishment. It was about recognizing that staying had begun to cost me parts of my identity I could no longer afford to lose. I had spent so much time preserving relationships that I had neglected the relationship I had with myself, and walking away became the only way to restore that balance. For a long time, I believed that endurance was proof of love. I thought that if I stayed patient enough, generous enough, quiet enough, things would eventually change. Walking away forced me to confront how deeply that belief had shaped my behavior. I had accepted discomfort as normal and sacrifice as expected. Choosing myself required unlearning the idea that my worth depended on how much I could tolerate. It meant acknowledging that love should not require self-erasure. The fear I felt was not about being alone. It was about stepping out of a role that had defined me for so long. When you are valued primarily for what you provide, leaving can feel like becoming invisible. I worried about who I would be without that identity, without the constant demand to fix and support. But beneath that fear was something steadier. There was relief in no longer bracing myself for the next request, the next disappointment, the next subtle reminder of my place. Walking away created space where there had only been pressure. In that space, I began to hear my own thoughts again. Decisions became quieter and clearer. I no longer measured my choices by how they would affect others who never measured the impact on me. I learned that peace does not announce itself loudly. It arrives slowly, through mornings without anxiety and evenings without dread. It arrives when you are no longer negotiating your value. There were moments of grief, but they were honest moments. I grieved not only the relationships I left behind, but the version of myself who believed that enduring mistreatment was the same as being loyal. Letting go of that belief was painful, but it was also necessary. Walking away allowed me to stop waiting for validation that was never coming and start offering myself the respect I had withheld. Choosing myself did not mean I stopped caring. It meant I stopped sacrificing my well-being for the comfort of others. It meant accepting that some people will never understand your boundaries because they benefited from you having none. That understanding brought clarity rather than bitterness. I no longer needed others to agree with my decision for it to be right. As time passed, the distance I created became a form of protection. It allowed wounds to settle and perspectives to shift. I learned to trust my instincts again, to recognize discomfort as information rather than something to suppress. Walking away taught me that boundaries are not walls meant to punish, but structures meant to hold your life together. In choosing myself, I reclaimed parts of me that had been quieted by obligation. I found strength in simplicity and confidence in stillness. I understood that walking away was not abandonment. It was an act of self-respect. And in that choice, I did not lose myself. I finally met myself fully, without apology, and that made every step away worth taking.